Let's start the book. Think like a monk. Introduction: Unlocking Inner Peace and True Power. We navigate a chaotic, fast-paced world, desperately chasing conventional success, yet so many of us end up feeling entirely empty and exhausted inside. Jay Shetty's profound journey from a rebellious London teenager to a dedicated Vedic monk and ultimately to a global wisdom teacher offers a brilliant roadmap out of this modern trap. By peeling back the layers of his extraordinary life, we discover how ancient monastic principles can completely transform our daily struggles. This is not just a fascinating memoir, it is a vital masterclass in finding true purpose, lasting joy, and unshakable peace. Point 1. The Rebel Who Met a Monk. Every profound transformation usually begins with an unexpected collision of entirely different worlds. For a young man aggressively chasing conventional success, a reluctant evening out would permanently alter the trajectory of his destiny. Growing up in North London, Jay Shetty was not exactly the picture of a future monk. Raised in a traditional Indian family, the cultural expectations heavily weighed upon his shoulders from a very young age. In his community, there was a well-known, unspoken rule about success. You could either become a doctor, a lawyer, or a failure. There was very little room for creative deviation, and the pressure to conform to these prestigious, high-earning career paths was immense. Yet, as a teenager, Jay found himself pushing back against these rigid boundaries. He was not a quiet, obedient student who spent all his hours studying in the library. Instead, he was a bit of a rebel. He hung out with the wrong crowds, got involved in fights, experimented with things he shouldn't have, and even faced suspensions from school. Beneath this rebellious exterior, however, was a deeply curious mind trying to figure out what actually made a life valuable. Fascinated by the concept of success, young Jay began devouring the autobiographies of CEOs, famous athletes, and global celebrities. He would read about people who had built massive empires, individuals who had climbed to the absolute pinnacle of their respective fields. He admired their drive, their wealth, and their status. To him, these were the people who had truly made it. But a subtle realization began to creep in as he read more about his heroes. Many of these incredibly wealthy and successful individuals were privately miserable. Their personal lives were often in shambles, marked by multiple divorces, profound loneliness, substance abuse, and severe burnout. They had conquered the world, yet they seemed to have lost themselves in the process. This glaring paradox planted a seed of doubt in Jay's mind about what true success actually looked like. When Jay was 18 and studying at university, a friend approached him with an unusual invitation. The friend asked Jay to come along to hear a monk speak on campus. Jay's immediate reaction was a firm rejection. Why would he, a young man obsessed with corporate success, wealth, and modern ambition, want to listen to a guy in robes who had given up everything? It sounded incredibly boring and entirely irrelevant to his life goals. But his friend was persistent, and Jay finally agreed to go on one strict condition. After the monk's talk, they had to go to a bar and grab some drinks. It was a perfectly negotiated compromise between the spiritual and the secular. Walking into the lecture hall, Jay had zero expectations. He sat in the back, arms crossed, ready to endure an hour of dry, disconnected spiritual lecturing. Then, the monk, Gauranga Das, began to speak. He was an Indian man in his 30s, dressed in simple saffron robes, radiating an aura of complete peace and unshakable joy. Gauranga Das did not talk about complicated religious doctrines or abstract mystical realms. Instead, he spoke about the profound nature of service. He delivered a message that struck Jay like a lightning bolt. The greatest, most noble thing you can possibly do with your entire life is to use your unique talents and abilities in the service of others. Jay was absolutely mesmerized. Here was a man who possessed absolutely zero material wealth. He had no fancy car, no impressive corporate title, no designer clothes, and no bank account. Yet he seemed infinitely happier, more grounded, and more genuinely successful than any of the billionaire CEOs Jay had been reading about. The monk possessed a deep intrinsic wealth that could not be touched by market crashes or corporate layoffs. For the first time in his life, Jay was standing in the presence of someone who had completely mastered their own mind. After the lecture, Jay abandoned all plans to go to the bar. Instead, he rushed to the front of the room to speak with Gauranga Das. He was desperate to know more, to understand how this man had achieved such a profound state of inner tranquility. This brief conversation sparked an obsession. Over the next few years, while his peers were spending their summers securing lucrative corporate internships at investment banks and consulting firms, Jay split his time between two entirely different worlds. Half of his summer would be spent in shiny London skyscrapers, wearing a suit and learning the ropes of the corporate world. The other half would be spent in a dusty, remote ashram in India, wearing simple robes, sleeping on the floor, and studying ancient Vedic philosophy. This dual life created a massive internal conflict. The corporate world offered money, status, and societal approval, but it felt increasingly hollow and ruthlessly competitive. The ashram offered no money and no status, but it provided a profound sense of purpose, community, and inner peace. As his university graduation approached, the ultimate crossroads loomed. He was offered lucrative jobs by prestigious companies. His parents were thrilled. Their son was finally on the path to becoming a wealthy, respectable professional. But Jay's heart had already made its choice. In a move that shocked his family and confused his friends, he politely declined the corporate job offers. He packed a small bag, gave away most of his possessions, and bought a one-way ticket to India. He was leaving behind the modern world to become a Vedic monk, stepping entirely into the unknown to discover who he truly was beneath the heavy expectations of society. Point 2. Stripping away the false identity. Leaving the modern world behind sounds deeply romantic and profoundly poetic until you actually have to sleep on a cold, hard floor. The ashram stripped away everything familiar, forcing a raw and sometimes painful confrontation with the truth beneath the surface. When Jay arrived at the ashram in Mumbai, he was immediately hit by the staggering reality of his decision. The romanticized vision of peaceful meditation in a serene mountain setting was quickly replaced by the intense, chaotic, and demanding environment of a working monastery. The heat was utterly oppressive, the air was thick with humidity, and the daily physical demands were grueling. One of the very first rituals he had to undergo was the shaving of his head. For a young man from London who was used to styling his hair and caring deeply about his physical appearance, this was a profound shock to the system. Looking in the mirror as his hair fell to the floor, Jay realized he was not just losing his hair, he was losing a major piece of his constructed identity. He had to hand over his trendy clothes, his smartphone, and his worldly possessions. He was given a simple set of robes that looked exactly like the robes worn by every other monk in the ashram. He was no longer Jay Shetty, the cool university graduate with a bright corporate future. He was just another student of the mind, starting entirely from scratch. This physical stripping away was merely the warm-up for the intense psychological dismantling that was about to occur. In his teachings, Jay introduces a powerful metaphor from the monastic tradition, the concept of the dusty mirror. Imagine that your true self, your soul, is a beautifully clear, pristine mirror. When the mirror is clean, it perfectly reflects your true nature, your deepest values, and your genuine purpose. However, as we go through life in the modern world, this mirror becomes covered in thick layers of dust. The dust represents the opinions of our parents, the expectations of society, the relentless messaging of the media, the pressure of our peers, and our own accumulated insecurities. We look into the mirror and we cannot see ourselves at all. We only see the thick, confusing layers of dust. We start to believe that the dust is who we actually are. Jay realized that his entire life in London had been built upon this dust. His desire to be wealthy, his pursuit of corporate success, his need to look a certain way. None of these were his genuine desires. They were simply the values of the culture he had absorbed. He vividly recalls a thought-provoking exercise where the monks were asked to deeply examine their core values. They were challenged to ask themselves, are my values actually my own, or did I inherit them from someone else without questioning them? It is a terrifying question to ask. When you realize that your desire for a luxury car was planted there by a clever marketing campaign, or that your desperation for a specific job title is just a way to win your father's approval, the foundation of your identity begins to crumble. The process of wiping the dust off the mirror is not a gentle, spa-like experience. It requires immense discipline, deep introspection, and a willingness to face one's own ego. In the ashram, there was no room for ego. The daily routine was deliberately designed to humble the students and break down their sense of self-importance. Jay and the other monks were required to wake up at 4 a.m. every single day. They took freezing cold showers to shock their nervous systems awake and build physical resilience. Then they would sit on the hard stone floor for hours of chanting and meditation. But the real test of ego did not happen during meditation. It happened during the daily chores. The monks were required to perform menial tasks to maintain the ashram. Jay found himself assigned to clean the communal toilets. Here he was, an educated university graduate from London, scrubbing toilets in a sweltering Indian ashram. His mind would violently rebel. His ego would scream at him, whispering toxic comparisons. Look at what you're doing. Your friends back in London are getting promotions, buying expensive suits, going to fancy restaurants, and you are here scrubbing human waste off a floor. You are wasting your potential. These moments of intense internal resistance were exactly what the monk training was designed to provoke. The ashram was a laboratory for the mind. When the ego flared up in indignation, the monk was expected to observe it, study it, and gently let it go. Jay had to learn that his worth was not tied to his job title, his intellect, or his social standing. His worth was intrinsic. By doing the lowest, most humbling tasks with a spirit of love and service, he was slowly scraping the thick, stubborn dust off his mirror. He began to understand that when you strip away the clothes, the money, the career, and the social media profiles, what remains is your true essence. And finding that true essence is the absolute prerequisite for living a meaningful life. You cannot build a solid house on a foundation of dust. Point 3. Confronting the demons of negativity. Solitude does not immediately bring peace. Often it brings you face to face with your loudest, most aggressive inner demons. Without the endless distractions of the modern city, the mind's toxicity becomes completely impossible to ignore. When Jay first arrived in India, he harbored a somewhat naive, romanticized expectation of monastic life. He assumed that the moment he put on the robes and sat in a quiet room, a profound wave of Zen-like tranquility would instantly wash over him. He thought the physical environment of the ashram would automatically silence his stressful thoughts. He could not have been more wrong. When you remove the distractions of smartphones, televisions, busy social calendars, and demanding jobs, you are left alone with the voice inside your head. And for the first few months, Jay discovered that the voice inside his head was incredibly loud, highly critical, and deeply negative. The monks teach extensively about the concept of the monkey mind. The untrained mind is like a wild, hyperactive monkey swinging frantically from branch to branch, constantly looking for the next piece of fruit, the next distraction, the next source of drama. It dwells on the past with regret and projects into the future with anxiety. In the ashram, there was a strict, non-negotiable rule: no gossiping and no complaining. This sounds simple in theory, but in practice, it is agonizingly difficult. Jay realized how much of human bonding in the modern world is actually built entirely upon shared negativity. We bond with our coworkers by complaining about the boss. We bond with our friends by gossiping about mutual acquaintances. We bond with strangers by complaining about the weather or the traffic. Without the outlet of verbal complaining, Jay noticed how much negativity was swirling around in his own brain. He would catch himself silently judging the other monks. He would watch another monk sweeping the courtyard and think, "He's not doing that right, I could do it better." Or he would listen to someone chanting and judge their pitch. He was shocked by his own arrogance and his mind's desperate need to find faults in others to make himself feel superior. To combat this deeply ingrained human tendency, the monks taught a brilliant practical framework that Jay calls spot, stop, swap. This is a mental martial art designed to neutralize negative thoughts before they can take root and poison your emotional state. Spot. The first step is profound self-awareness. You must become the observer of your own thoughts. When a negative, jealous, or angry thought arises, you must spot it immediately. You simply acknowledge, "I am feeling jealous right now," or "I am judging that person." Stop. Once you spot the thought, you must actively pause. You do not scold yourself or spiral into guilt. You gently but firmly stop the thought from gaining momentum. You refuse to feed the monkey. Swap. This is the transformative step. You actively replace the negative thought with a constructive, positive, or empathetic one. For example, if Jay caught himself judging a fellow monk who was struggling to wake up early, he would spot the judgment. He would stop the thought process. Then he would swap it with empathy, reminding himself, "This monk was up late last night studying scriptures and working hard. I should be compassionate just as I would want compassion when I am tired." By practicing this thousands of times, the neural pathways of negativity begin to physically weaken, and the pathways of empathy and positivity grow stronger. Beyond daily negativity, the ashram also forced Jay to confront a much deeper, more primal demon, fear. In the modern world, we spend our entire lives running away from fear. We numb it with endless entertainment, we hide from it behind busy schedules, and we mask it with false bravado. The monks take the exact opposite approach. They believe that fear is not an enemy to be destroyed, but a deeply misunderstood friend trying to tell you something important. Fear is a warning signal, an indicator of what you care about and where you feel vulnerable. Jay recalls powerful exercises designed to make the monks comfortable with fear and discomfort. They would engage in intense breath work, sometimes holding their breath underwater or sitting in extreme temperatures. The goal was not to torture themselves, but to observe the mind's panic response. When the body signals fear, the untrained mind screams, "We are going to die, panic, run away." The trained monk mind calmly observes the physical sensation of fear, regulates the nervous system through deep, slow breathing, and rationally assesses the situation. Jay realized that most of the fears he brought from London, the fear of missing out, the fear of failing, the fear of not being respected, were entirely psychological illusions. They were ghosts created by the ego. By sitting completely still in meditation, leaning directly into the discomfort, and examining his fears under the bright light of awareness, the demons lost their terrifying power. He learned the vital lesson that you cannot defeat the darkness by punching it. You can only defeat it by turning on the light of your own awareness. Point 4. Discovering the rhythm of Dharma. True fulfillment is never about violently forcing yourself into a rigid mold that simply does not fit your soul. It is about discovering your own unique rhythm and offering it entirely to the world. As Jay settled into the rhythm of monastic life, a new, unexpected struggle began to emerge. The ashram was not a monolithic place where everyone did exactly the same thing. While all the monks shared the same core values and practiced the same daily rituals, they had very different roles and responsibilities. Some monks were brilliant cooks, spending their days joyfully preparing massive quantities of food for the community. Some were incredible administrators, organizing events and managing the ashram's complex logistics. Some were deeply mystical, capable of sitting in absolute silent meditation for 12 hours straight without moving a muscle. Jay looked at the deeply meditative monks with profound awe and an unhealthy amount of envy. In his mind, that was what a real monk looked like. So he aggressively tried to force himself to be like them. He would force himself to sit in silent, solitary meditation for hours on end, trying to empty his mind and achieve mystical states of consciousness. But instead of feeling enlightened, he just felt incredibly frustrated, deeply restless, and mentally exhausted. His mind would wander, his body would ache, and he found the solitary silence incredibly draining rather than recharging. He began to feel a familiar sense of failure creeping in. Was he a bad monk? Did he lack the spiritual discipline required for this life? His senior teachers, who were master observers of human nature, noticed his immense struggle. They pulled him aside for a life-changing conversation regarding the ancient Vedic concept of Dharma. In the simplest terms, Dharma is your true calling. It is the perfect intersection of your natural passion, your innate expertise, and what is genuinely useful to the world. The teachers explained that it is a massive spiritual mistake to try to live someone else's dharma. In fact, ancient texts state that it is better to fail at your own dharma than to succeed at the dharma of another. The monks introduced Jay to the concept of the varnas, which are essentially four distinct psychological archetypes or occupational natures. 1. Guides. These are the teachers, the philosophers, the counselors. They love learning, digesting complex information, and sharing wisdom to help others grow. 2. Leaders. These are the protectors, the organizers, the commanders. They thrive on courage, providing structure, and leading teams to achieve big goals. 3. Creators. These are the innovators, the marketers, the entrepreneurs. They love building things, making connections, and driving progress. 4. Makers. These are the artists, the engineers, the essential workers. They find joy in tangible creation, stability, and mastering a specific physical craft. Jay's teachers pointed out that his natural inclination was not to sit in a cave in silence. Whenever he learned a profound piece of Vedic philosophy, his immediate instinct was to figure out how to explain it to someone else. He loved talking, he loved connecting with people, and he had a natural gift for taking complex ancient texts and making them highly relatable and easy to understand. He was fundamentally a guide and a creator. This realization was like a massive weight being lifted off his chest. He stopped forcing himself to be the silent mystic and fully embraced his true nature. He started spending more time studying the scriptures with the specific intention of teaching them. He began giving lectures to the newer monks and visitors to the ashram. When he aligned his daily activities with his natural dharma, the exhaustion vanished, replaced by an endless wellspring of energy and enthusiasm. This is a profoundly relatable lesson for the modern world. How many of us are utterly miserable because we are trying to live someone else's dharma? We see a friend become a highly successful investment banker, so we try to force ourselves into finance, even though we are naturally artistic makers. We see an entrepreneur on social media building a tech startup, so we try to become leaders, even though our true calling is to be a quiet, supportive guide. Jay's experience in the ashram proves that true success is not about climbing to the top of a random ladder. It is about ensuring the ladder is leaning against the right wall. When you discover your dharma, work stops feeling like a punishment and transforms into an expression of your deepest self. Point 5. Taming the wild chariot of the mind. The mind can either be your absolute greatest enemy or your most incredibly devoted ally. Mastering it requires deeply understanding its mechanics rather than just blindly fighting its impulses. One of the most powerful and enduring lessons Jay learned during his time as a monk came from an ancient metaphor found in the Upanishads, a classic Indian spiritual text. To truly understand how human psychology works, the sages used the imagery of a chariot. Imagine a magnificent chariot moving along a road. The chariot itself represents your physical body. The horses pulling the chariot represent your five senses: sight, sound, smell, taste, touch. They are wild, powerful, and constantly reacting to the environment, wanting to pull towards whatever looks good or smells good. The reins connecting the horses to the chariot represent your mind. The charioteer holding the reins represents your intellect, your higher reasoning, and your wisdom. The passenger sitting quietly in the back of the chariot represents your soul, your true self. In most modern people's lives, the charioteer, the intellect, is asleep at the wheel. Because the intellect is asleep, the reins, the mind, are completely loose. As a result, the wild horses, the senses, are entirely in control. If the horses see a delicious slice of chocolate cake, they violently pull the chariot off the road to get it, even if the intellect knows you are on a diet. If the horses see an engaging, dramatic video on social media, they pull you down a 2-hour rabbit hole, completely ignoring the fact that you have an important project due. When the senses are in charge, the chariot crashes, and the passenger, the soul, suffers immensely. The entire purpose of monk training is to wake up the charioteer. You must use your intellect to grab the reins of your mind tightly, which allows you to steer the wild horses of your senses exactly where you want them to go. You do not kill the horses, you need your senses to navigate the world, but you absolutely must discipline them. To train the intellect and take control of the mind, Jay learned the absolute necessity of a highly structured routine. In the modern world, we often view routine as boring or restrictive. We idolize the idea of going with the flow and being entirely spontaneous. But the monks understand that true freedom is only born from profound discipline. If you do not control your schedule, your wild horses will control it for you. Jay emphasizes the massive importance of the morning routine. How you start your day sets the psychological tone for the entire chariot ride. If you wake up, immediately grab your phone, read stressful news, and check chaotic work emails, you have instantly handed the reins over to the horses of anxiety and reaction. To combat this, Jay developed the time framework, a practical way to wake up the charioteer every single morning. Thankfulness. Start the day by expressing genuine gratitude. Before looking at a screen, find one thing to be deeply thankful for. This shifts the mind from scarcity to abundance. Insight. Read or listen to something deeply inspiring or educational. Feed your intellect with wisdom before the world feeds it with noise and advertising. Meditation. Spend a few minutes in absolute silence. Connect with your breath. This is the act of the charioteer firmly gripping the reins, centering the mind, and observing the present moment. Exercise. Move the physical body. Yoga, stretching, or a brisk walk. This ensures the chariot itself is well maintained and ready for the journey. But Jay also reveals a profound monastic secret. The morning routine actually begins the night before. If you spend your evening binge watching violent television shows and eating junk food, your intellect will be groggy and weak the next morning. By consciously designing a calming evening routine, winding down, disconnecting from screens, and preparing for rest, you ensure that your charioteer wakes up sharp, strong, and entirely ready to command the horses. Mastering the mind is not an event. It is a daily, deliberate practice of taking back the reins. Point 6. The painful departure and rebirth. Sometimes the universe violently pushes you off your carefully chosen path, leaving you completely broken, deeply confused, and emotionally shattered. What feels like a devastating final failure is often the exact necessary setup for your true calling. Jay had fully committed his life to the ashram. He loved the community, he loved the deep philosophical studies, and he had found his rhythm as a teacher. He envisioned himself wearing the saffron robes for the rest of his life, peacefully growing old within the sacred walls of the monastery. He felt he had finally arrived at his ultimate destination. But life and the human body have a funny way of altering our grandest plans. After roughly 3 years of intense monastic life, Jay's physical health began to rapidly deteriorate. The extreme regime, waking up at 4 a.m. every day, fasting, sleeping on hard floors, and the intense physical labor in the punishing Indian heat was taking a severe toll on his body. He was constantly exhausted, his immune system was crashing, and he was getting sick repeatedly. Because his mind was so fiercely dedicated to his spiritual path, he tried to entirely ignore his failing body. He pushed through the pain, hiding his weakness, terrified that admitting he was sick would mean he was spiritually weak. However, his senior teachers were incredibly observant. Gauranga Das, the monk who had initially inspired Jay to change his life, pulled him aside for a painfully honest conversation. The teachers had been watching Jay closely, not just his physical health, but his spiritual trajectory. Gauranga Das looked at Jay and delivered a message that absolutely shattered him. Your path is not to remain here in the ashram. You have learned what you needed to learn here. Your true dharma is to take this wisdom, return to the modern world, and share it with those who desperately need it. To Jay, this sounded like the ultimate rejection. He felt as though he had been fired from being a monk. The devastation was profound and suffocating. He had given up everything: his career prospects, his possessions, his relationships in London, to walk this path, and now he was being told he couldn't stay. He felt like a colossal failure. He had to pack his tiny bag, take off his sacred robes, put on civilian clothes, and board a flight back to London. The flight home was one of the darkest, most agonizing experiences of his life. He was returning to the exact world he had so proudly rejected 3 years prior. When he landed in London, the contrast was brutal. He was in his late 20s, moving back into his childhood bedroom at his parents' house. He had absolutely zero money in his bank account. He had a massive 3-year gap on his resume that looked entirely inexplicable to corporate recruiters. He had no romantic partner. Meanwhile, his old university friends had spent those 3 years climbing the corporate ladder. They were buying houses, getting married, driving nice cars, and securing massive promotions. Jay plunged into a deep, heavy depression. The ego he thought he had dismantled in the ashram flared back up with a vengeance, screaming at him that he was a loser, a reject, and a failure who had wasted his most productive years. He spent weeks barely leaving his room, paralyzed by shame and uncertainty. But it was precisely in this dark night of the soul that the monk training truly revealed its immense power. In the ashram, it is easy to be peaceful when everyone around you is peaceful. The real test of the teachings is when you are thrown into the fire of real-world suffering. Jay realized he had to apply the spot, stop, swap technique to his own depression. He had to recognize that his feelings of failure were entirely tied to external, societal metrics of success, the very dust he had worked so hard to wipe off his mirror. He had to consciously remind himself that his worth was not determined by his bank balance or a job title. Slowly, agonizingly, he began to rebuild his internal foundation. He forgave himself for his perceived failure and began to view his departure not as a rejection, but as a graduation. The universe had violently pushed him out of the nest because it was time for him to fly in a completely different sky. He was ready for a rebirth. Point 7. The conclusion. The ultimate true test of spiritual wisdom is not how gracefully you can sit in a quiet, isolated cave, but how effectively you can apply that peace in the deafening noise of a bustling city. The monk's journey truly begins the moment he returns home. Re-entering the corporate world of London was a massive culture shock for Jay. Updating his resume was a comical and frustrating exercise. How do you translate "spent 3 years meditating, chanting, and cleaning ashram toilets" into corporate buzzwords? He eventually managed to secure a job at a large, prestigious consulting firm, Accenture. Suddenly, he was back in a suit, riding the crowded, stressful London Underground and sitting in brightly lit corporate offices. As he reconnected with his old university friends and began interacting with his new corporate colleagues, Jay noticed something deeply alarming. The people who had achieved all the things he had once desired, the massive salaries, the impressive titles, the beautiful homes, were profoundly suffering. They were burned out, highly anxious, deeply depressed, and constantly stressed. Their marriages were falling apart. They were relying on alcohol to numb their anxiety, and they felt entirely empty inside. Slowly, his friends and colleagues started asking him about his time in India. They noticed that Jay possessed a strange, unshakable calm amidst the high-pressure corporate environment. When deadlines loomed and executives panicked, Jay remained incredibly focused and grounded. They began inviting him to dinners and asking him for advice. Jay started teaching small, informal mindfulness sessions in local London pubs, living rooms, and eventually in corporate boardrooms. He was translating the ancient Vedic wisdom he had learned into practical, modern language that stressed out executives could actually understand and use. This was the magical moment when his true Dharma finally clicked into perfect alignment. He realized that Garanga Das had been absolutely right. The corporate world did not need another stressed out manager. It desperately needed a guide. It needed someone who understood the pressures of modern life but possessed the psychological tools of a monk. Driven by the monastic principle of give, the idea that the highest purpose of life is selfless service, Jay decided to scale his teachings. He realized that while teaching 20 people in a living room was great, the internet allowed him to serve millions. He started creating short, highly engaging videos on social media, breaking down complex concepts like purpose, toxic relationships, overcoming fear, and finding inner peace. He didn't use confusing spiritual jargon. He used relatable stories, modern examples, and high-quality storytelling. The response was absolute explosion. His videos went viral, resonating with millions of people across the globe who were starving for meaning in a superficial digital age. He transitioned from a quiet corporate employee to a global phenomenon, launching a massively successful podcast, writing a best-selling book, and building a community of millions. Yet, despite the immense external success, Jay's internal compass remains firmly rooted in his monk training. He still wakes up early, he still meditates daily, and he still views his massive platform not as a source of personal ego or fame, but as a vehicle for profound service. The ultimate message of his incredible journey is both empowering and deeply accessible. You do not need to shave your head, give away all your money, and move to an ashram in India to find peace. The ashram is simply a state of mind. By consciously choosing to let go of false identities, continuously growing through discipline and self-awareness, and dedicating your life to giving and serving others, anyone, anywhere, can learn to think like a monk. The peace you are so desperately searching for out in the world has actually been waiting patiently inside of you this entire time. Let's start the book.